Welcome, everyone. I'm Barbara Call, Global Director for Content Strategy at CIO Marketing Services, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's webcast titled Accelerating AI Adoption, Impact from AI in Days at 55 Times Lower Cost, and brought to you by CIO, Able, Intel, and a guest speaker from IDC. I have two guests with me today. First up is Ashish Nadkarni, Group Vice President and General Manager within IDC's Worldwide Infrastructure Research Organization. Welcome, Ashish. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I lead IDC's worldwide infrastructure research, been with the company for 12 years. And as always, it's an exciting time to be tracking infrastructure in the world of AI. Thank you.
Nice to have you. Thank you, Ashish. And my second speaker is Arjit Sengupta, founder and CEO at Able. Arjit, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for the opportunity, Barbara. And Able is bringing the power of AI to every business user. But before this, I started something called Beyond Core, which became Salesforce Einstein Discovery. Actually ended up writing a book called AI is a Waste of Money, based on the 1,000 AI projects I had done at that time. And that led to the Harvard Business School bringing me back in to co-create and co-teach the first AI course in the MBA program at Harvard. And studied AI at Stanford before it was popular, have I think something like 24, 27 patents in the space. So recovering nerd and really enjoying the collaboration with Intel and you guys.
Awesome. Nice to have you. And now I'll hand things over to Ashish to kick us off.
Thanks, Barbara. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to begin by pointing out how far we have come. Last year, enterprises were dreaming of just generative AI and the various possibilities that they could unfold with that. We had many firms making claims about the impact of generative AI on global GDP, human productivity, and on product and service development. 1 year later, where do we stand? IDC's global monthly survey of tech decision makers reported that they had conducted, on average, 37 POCs in the last 12 months. Of that, only 5 made it into production. And of those 5 that made it into production, the success rate was less than 70%. That's a lot of POCs that never made it into production, and the success rate isn't kind of a resounding validation of the promise there. So my question then is, can we reach a point where AI initiatives can be deployed into production in a factory-like manner? And I'd like to pose this question to you, Arjit. Able claims to have a 30-day satisfaction guarantee for delivering impact from AI. On the surface, it sounds too good to be true. Can you enlighten us on how you go about doing this?
Well, the funny thing is, it's not just you who thought it was too good to be true. When we first started partnering with Intel, and this has been in a press release, so I can say this, the reaction from the Intel innovation team was put up or shut up, right? Like, if you guys can really do this, let's prove it out. And it was almost phrased as a challenge. So what Intel did with us is we jointly went to 25 customers. And for every one of those customers, we tracked how long it took from raw data being provided all the way to final delivery of the project. And it ranged from as little as, I think it was 2 days might have been the shortest one. There might have been something shorter. There was definitely one where we did 4 projects in 30 days. And the point was all 25 projects got done in 30 days. And the reason for it is you actually have to think differently about the problem. And I'll come back to that in a second. If you just do it the waterfall way, top down, let me spec everything out, let me create all the screens and deliver, you can't do it this way. You have to go with a 24-hour, 48-hour rapid prototype, get all stakeholders around it, get their feedback, and then rapidly iterate over 30 days to get it done. And we typically work with our customers on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday, depending on the customer. And during those 30 days, we are doing like 60, 70 iterations of the solution until the point where the customer is ecstatic about it, right? So, but the reason we have to do this, I love the data you guys put up about the pilots going into production. I actually heard a very fun thing from one of our customers. They're like, I hope most of my Gen AI projects don't succeed, because once it goes into production, the cost is going to be so high, I don't have the budget to pay for it, right? So like success can become a problem. So next year, maybe you'll have the drop down for of the 5 things that went into production, how many got canceled because the cost was too high. And this is the important part of this. Like, if you look forward and you design your process with that kind of flexibility, and again, we'll talk about that later as well. But if you don't think about this holistically, as every pilot you're doing has to go to scale, how will you deal with that? Every pilot you're doing is going to have the tech pulled out underneath it during, like sometimes the tech changes on us during 30 days, right? Like Palm 2 got basically deprecated in the middle of the of some of our projects we were doing. Great, we moved on to Gemini. That's not a problem as long as you're built for that.
Thank you. So I guess the question really is, what will it take organizations to scale their AI proof of concept, and eventually what will it take for them to move into the adoption stage to the acceleration stage, what we would refer to as an AI fueled business? In our conversations today, I'll focus on the blockers that your organization might be facing, and Arjit and I will discuss some of the ways you move beyond them. So with that in mind, so Arjit, my understanding is that companies usually experiment with a single use case in a standalone fashion, and then when they shift more than one of them into production, maintaining at scale becomes problematic. Operations become challenging, costs increase dramatically, and invariably what you build breaks. So, what can you tell us about how Able is thinking about this problem? And specifically, when you are experimenting with AI, how is it that it's successfully adopted, moved into production, and then scaled, more importantly?
So one of them, but firstly, I couldn't agree with you more. Like I love the point you're making. And one of the most common things we hear from customers, at least we used to hear it a lot more earlier this year, now it's petering off, is, hey, we have this team in IT that cobbled together this exact same prototype you just showed me in 15 minutes. We have built the same thing. And what we always ask them is, okay, but how long did it take you to build that same thing? I did in 15 minutes from scratch. How long did it take you? Okay, the answer is it took me 6 months. Now we ask them, okay, and how did you build it? Well, we went in, we got some requirements from business stakeholders. We said, here is what the app needs to do. We handed it to a data science team. We handed it to IT. They use something like LangChain. They use this vector database. They use this tech. They use that tech. They stitched it together into a solution. And now we have everything. And my next question usually is, and what happens if the language model changes? And you'd see this deer in the headlights. Like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, this tech is changing every month, every week. So what are you going to do when the tech changes, right? Okay, now imagine you have built 5 such solutions, because your company is not going to do just one GenAI project. So let's say you have 5. When the language model changes, you're going to do the same thing for all 5. What about the vector to be changing? So one of the first problems people are like running into is, when tech constantly changes, you cannot have the same mentality you had when you were implementing ERP or CRM or something like that. Because when you got that project done, you were done. You could move on to the next thing. Now it is like you finished that project, but you have to keep doing that project over and over again if you've done it the wrong way, because every time the tech landscape changes, you got to go redo it. It's like tech debt is no longer 7 years. It's like maybe a month, right? So what we did is we started with this idea of segregated serverless capabilities. We said every part of this needs to be serverless. So if I'm using a language model, it is a serverless capability. If it's a vector database, it's a serverless capability, completely adjustable to the user, to the use case, and then stitched together through kind of invocation. Now, for the people who don't know what serverless is, think of it as, today you lease a server. You go to Google and you ask for a server for a month or for a day, for an hour, but you're leasing a server. It's more like leasing a car that you keep running in your garage, whether or not you use it. But serverless is like using Uber. I need a car for the next 15 minutes. I get a car for the next 15 minutes. I need a server for 3 seconds. I get a server for 3 seconds. And that exists in all 3 companies. But one of the cool things is it can scale up like crazy. I can have one serverless instance running or 1,000 serverless instances running. It's not that complex. Or if I want to run 5 different models, but I keep my serverless environment consistent, just changing the model weights, not a problem, right? So it gives you a lot more flexibility. And one of the interesting things it does is when you scale, your operating cost is already designed to be low. Because if you designed your prototype, your whatever you are doing, the pilot, with let's say 500 users in mind, now you got to 5,000 users. That's a wrenching change. 50,000 users, that's a wrenching change. In serverless, it doesn't matter whether you're doing 5 users or 5,000 users. As you're using it, the resources, the appropriate resources just become available. And this is true of all 3 major clouds. So it works the consistent way on Google, on AWS, and on Azure.
Thank you. So, with that foundation in mind, let's sort of shift to the business side and the long term view, right, of where organizations are heading and how this sort of serves as the foundation. So, in the coming years, you as an organization will be undergoing a lot of business transformation. There'll be another business first, digital first business. But we want to get to the AI fueled business. And most of the use cases that we talked about, that Arjit talked about, that you implement will have some or the other form of AI. And then as your organization employs AI to work differently, innovate faster, and engage better with your customers. And that means a fundamental shift into what that AI fueled business model needs to look like. So as you pursue your AI strategy, AI assistants, advisors, agents, they'll be working alongside employees, a new technology foundation, unified governance model. All of these are really then going to serve as foundations to launch new AI initiatives. And for that, I think you need a technology first AI operating model, which kind of talks about how technology comes together to support that AI fueled business. And at the heart of it are, things that Arjit talked about, AI platforms that orchestrate end to end the build and development of AI applications, autonomous business processes, and the likes. And then crucially, I think it's a shift in how infrastructure is deployed and managed. And as we look at your journey, the organization is on. From the past year of scrambling to just experiment and adopt, you're now going to start to accelerate, take a more structured approach, an organized approach to AI projects, to building a business that will be fueled by AI technologies. And it's important to spend time looking at, how do you pivot? This is a pivotal moment. So pivoting from the experimentation phase to the AI fueled phase. And as you've experimented with generative AI, you've told us about these blockers. You've told us about how, when you look holistically across your enterprise, the 3 areas that we see as blockers. First is, your strategy. We talked about that, your governance, and then finally your technology costs. So, shifting gears, I think the AI enterprise strategy is really rooted in AI use cases that are focused on business differentiation. In speaking with CIOs, we've heard many, many times how you treat Gen AI use cases like any other innovation initiatives, where there's like 100 plus potential Gen AI projects that are strewn across the organization. You run them through the standard process, and you ultimately yielding a small percentage that makes it into production. And IDC conducted a global survey of Gen AI, use cases and initiatives for 2024. And when you look at the enterprise view, this adds up to around 80 or so Gen AI initiatives. And unfortunately, only 39% of respondents told us that there is good coordination. The rest is sort of saying that there are poor coordination between the IT and lines of businesses. And this is nothing new, right? We've seen this before. We've seen this movie before. And so the idea is to get to a higher success rate. So the question then for you, Arjit, is how do you help organizations determine which use cases should make the list? Which use cases pop up on your list more frequently?
There's a short answer and there's a long answer. The short answer is we always suggest go take a look at something that's affecting your revenue because then proving the ROI is much easier. Then go to cost. Even though a lot of companies are starting from efficiency because it's easier, actually cost becomes harder to get big ROI from, and then going to risk. So revenue, cost, risk, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you will, for the enterprise. But what we are finding is business users don't know what they want, because what is happening is they don't have a frame of reference yet. Their frame of reference is ChatGPT, where they ask for a cookie recipe and then they ask for a poem for their wife, right? In the enterprise, the data is unique. The terminologies are unique. The personas are unique. There's a business process underneath it. So you can't actually have AI work magically in the enterprise. So when you go to business stakeholders and ask them for what do you want, they're going to give you like the flying car from Back to the Future. Whereas what they really might have done is, if you had give them a nice sports car, if you give them a nice boat, you give them a nice plane, you give them a nice helicopter, they might come in and say, I want that car, but I want it painted red, because now they have a frame of reference. They're starting from something of value and then saying, could you adjust it this way? And by starting from the requirements from the business stakeholders, we're actually making a big mistake. The other thing is, when you start with the business stakeholders and just ask them what do you want, rather than getting them into this experimentation, rapid prototyping mindset, they're going to replicate what they're doing today. So one of the most useful projects we did recently was a procure to pay use case. Actually, sorry, there was an order to cash one that we were working on recently. Procure to pay also happened. But order to cash was, when the order came in, they wanted to very quickly figure out what are all the potential issues. I need to figure out, is there a stock out risk? Will this person pay me or not? Right? I have a shortage of, like, what shipment company should I use? If I have to configure this, is there a risk to configuring it? And all that stuff, right? No business user would have given them that requirement because it spanned multiple business users. But once we got the rapid prototyping going, people started ideating and they're like, well, couldn't we pull this forward? Couldn't we pull that forward? And we ended up with the agentic flow that spanned about 7 different AI to solve a problem. So you can't start from your frame of reference of what are you doing today. You have to start from your frame of reference on, this is what AI can do with your data, because it has to be grounded in your data. It has to be grounded in your reality, but make it possible for the users to play with that AI. Try different questions. This succeeded, that failed. Hey, failure is not a problem. If you failed quickly, that's good. You learn from it. Or the team can follow along behind them and fix the problems where things failed, right? Once they have figured out at a high level, that's a rapid prototype, that this is something that kind of works for us. And here are the 7 things it got wrong. Like often they'll have 50 questions, 30 of which came out correctly, 20 came out wrong. That's when the 30 days of rapid iteration comes in. Because, do I use prompt augmentation to make that work? Do I use fine tuning to make that work? Do I use a different model? Do I use a different preprocessor? The business user has no idea what I just said to you right now, right? But they shouldn't. Once they've dialed in the problem, through those 30 days, we iterate on the tech side, and the business stakeholders are involved throughout. They're coming in for 30 minutes every other day or 2 times a week, and they're providing feedback. And it's like kind of it's like Christmas, right? They ask for, could I have this? Next meeting, or sometimes in the call itself, you can change the prompt and give them what they ask for, right? That kind of an approach actually gets you to the right use cases. Don't try to come up with the use cases top down. Don't create 1,000 use case lists. That actually means you're setting yourself up for failure. Empower 1,000 users in your company to build rapid prototypes themselves. Like our tagline is, I am able. And in fact, that's why the company is named Able, is we always believe it has to be the business user who's empowered to make their own AI. And then the experts can make that AI better. You need the experts to really go to scale, really make it perfect. But it's the business user who starts, and they're solving their own problems because they understand the problem the best and they understand whether the solution works the best.
That makes sense. So let's switch to the topic of governance. And you made some points that kind of brings this whole conversation to the fore. So AI governance is multifaceted. You certainly gave some examples of where there is a need for unified AI governance, a model that encompasses not just technical governance, but also ethics, principles, compliance, and incorporates some of the stakeholder concerns. So when we talk about unified governance, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it. But when we talk about unified governance, we talk about inputs, we talk about strategy and oversight, we talk about organization and culture, we talk about the tech architecture, the processes, the risk associated, the assessment of that risk, operations is a big part of it. And then finally, monitoring and measuring it through audits and metrics. So the question for you is, how do you approach it? What are the ways in which you look at governance by design and not governance by process?
So the first thing I'll tell you where governance fails today. There are organizations we work with where they have 6-month long approval processes from a governance perspective. The tech is changing so fast, by the time you have approved it, that tech is no longer worth implementing, right? So we came at it from a bottoms up approach. We said, look, we need to create a safe playground for the business stakeholders so that they can try things very easily. Well, how do I do that? We got to keep everything in the customer's cloud inside their VPC. The models are running in their cloud. The data never leaves their cloud. Structured or unstructured data never leaves their cloud. If you're doing fine tuning, if you're collecting user feedback, all of that is happening in their cloud. The fine tuned model is running in their cloud. So what you just did is you created this happy barrier around the entirety of the use cases. So you're not sitting there trying to case by case thinking about, is my data at a high risk? Is it at low risk? It's all under your control. Doesn't matter. Then if I'm doing fine tuning can actually leak information to a user who is not authorized to see it, because these models can actually memorize information as you fine tune them. So we made that role based. In fact, it can be user based. So you could segregate the models, you could segregate the vector databases, you could segregate the fine tuned models. So you can certify that Origit's AI never got information access that Origit didn't have access to, right? Then AI will hallucinate. And one of the fascinating things I'm seeing is a lot of really big companies who should know better going out there and claiming they've eliminated hallucination. You can't do it with generative AI. You can reduce it, you can ground the AI, you can do a lot of different things to make it better. You cannot eliminate hallucination given the architectures we have today. So what we do is we have a second AI parse the output of the generative AI. We do all the standard stuff too. We do the grounding. We do all of the things that are best practices for reducing hallucination. But when we put a final check, we call it blue is true. So we have a deterministic AI parsing the output of the generative and independently tracing back to source documents. Whether that's a chart in a database, whether that is a snippet of a PDF, we are tracing it back. And if we can trace it back, we mark it in blue, and the user can put their mouse on top of that blue text and see that chart pop up. And that chart has Python code backing it up in the customer's environment. What you're doing here is assuming that the system will break, and then putting a protection so that in the worst case, if the user does everything wrong, they're still protected. And then finally, we do monitor the user. So every interaction is logged, and we actually look for anomalous prompts. Now, anomalous prompts doesn't mean the user is doing something wrong. They could be trying something new. They could be trying something innovative. But you can flag that and have the organization look at it and say, okay, Origit is doing a lot of anomalous prompts. What the heck is he doing? Can we learn from it? Or do we need to go look at this guy and, maybe he's doing something wrong? Don't assume people are doing wrong. Build that empowerment into your process. Trust, then verify.
Let's now switch to the conversation around buy, compose, and build. It's an important decision criteria because how the path you choose will dictate your costs, the technology, the people who need to implement it, the maintenance of that technology, the cost to integrate the different models, the data services, and the likes. And it's a very complex and involved decision. And in a recent survey about GenAI use case adoption, we asked organizations which approach they're taking to each of these use cases. And you can see that very few cases require you to build your own model. Rather, most use cases require some kind of a composing function. And as you compose your model, the key is to look for use cases with reusable components. So the cost of development is lower, and you can scale better as you roll out more use cases across the organization. So the question, Arjit, for you is, what are you seeing with your customers, and how are you advising them on this whole journey or the notion around buy, compose, and build?
So in the buy part, one of the things they're beginning to realize is they have tried using things like co-pilots from various companies. I'm not picking on a specific company here. And then it doesn't work because the customer's data is unique, the customer's terminology is unique, the customer's user roles are unique. And unless you have customized to that data, the generative AI has never seen that kind of data. We work with some of the largest Fortune 50 companies in the world. And one of the telcos we were working with, they used a term like jitter, which means something very specific to them. Another Fortune 50 health insurer uses the word impact to mean something very specific. How does the GenAI know these things, right? So you have to fine tune the models or you have to adjust these models for that customer. And that's where the buy part falls apart. So buy is great if you're summarizing emails or generating marketing copy, things that are similar to the data the language model has seen. And I don't think most people should be building, by the way. So I think most of them should be composing in the middle, because the idea is take the language model, then solve the last mile problem. The last mile problem is that that language model has never seen your data. And we ran this experiment where we took a smaller model. This was in March. So it was Mistral 7B we were using, which is not the most advanced small model right now. But with just $90 of fine tuning, that Mistral model performed better than GPT-4. Without that fine tuning, it did worse. But what you're doing is you're taking a smaller model, giving it that specialization so that it can do better for that specific task. Think of it as you're going to a hospital, you don't go to the heart surgeon and ask them about stomach problems. Once you specialize these models, they actually do much better. But if you don't specialize them, the small model will perform much worse than a large language model. So that is where we are seeing it's going to go, is people taking these models and making their own. Now, often people say, well, that's going to be too hard. I don't know how to do it. So we ran this contest for 4 years now, and the last year this was on GenAI. So all 4 years it was at UC Berkeley, where we took a bunch of high school kids, history majors, and MBAs, and put them up against expert data scientists using their favorite tools. And this is at Berkeley, so the expert data scientists are actually expert data scientists, right? And all 4 years, the high school kids have beaten the expert data scientists. And this year for the GenAI part, they did things like prompt augmentation. They actually did, one of them did fine tuning. The high school kids were getting things done that the expert data scientists were not doing. It's just that the tooling has to be made appropriate. And that's what Able has focused on, is how can a high school kid provide feedback on the output of the GenAI? They just edit the answer in place. And the system says, what was the original answer? What's the new answer? Okay, I got some useful information. We do the fine tuning automatically and we deploy the model back. So taking all the data science complexity out so that just anybody can do this. But that's the direction the market has to go. It cannot be AI by the few for the many. That would be way too disempowering. It has to be AI for each individual. Thus, I am able.
So let's continue this buy, compose, build conversation into the world of infrastructure, because I know you guys have done a lot of things there from the scaling perspective. You talked about some of that. What we find is that organizations constantly underestimate the role played by infrastructure, and it totally has a lopsided effect on the outcome. So on one side, over investing in infrastructure means now you have a whole lot of infrastructure that is underutilized, budget constraints and overruns, and your ROI is totally destroyed. Now, on the other side, you might underinvest thinking that AI is just another workload, and then now you're going to be faced with scaling issues, subpar outcomes, and the likes. So how do you, and you talked about some of the serverless capabilities and such, how do you address infrastructure scalability and specifically insufficient compute capacity, which is, I think, a big deal for a lot of people. And, I think it's important for people to hear what you have to say.
Well, so first thing you need to understand is there's a lot of waste today. So if you go talk to your data scientists, just ask them what they do. They'll go in and reserve a massive server with a bunch of GPUs because they're going to run a project on it. And they're not freeing up that project overnight. They're not freeing up the server overnight. They're definitely not freeing it up every time they're getting a cup of coffee. So you're basically renting that server and running it, but you're actually productively using it for a very small percentage of the time. So as I said, this is like leasing a car, but it gets worse because you're running that car the whole time, right? It's creating CO2. It's using up energy. It is just unproductive use. It's just sitting there for when the data scientist wants to do something with it. That's why we went to serverless, because just for the, if you care about the planet at all, you do not want to see compute capacity getting wasted this way, given how much energy consumption happens. And Intel was fantastic about this. Like, we were a little concerned that they would be like, well, it's good for us if people just use up the compute. But they worked with us and we benchmarked it. And we were able to show that you can use these servers, in some cases, 55 times more productively if you use them as serverless. Basically, your car is getting used like a Uber, so you're getting 55 times the consumption out of the same thing. Now, whether you see that as a 55 times cost reduction or a 55 times impact on the energy footprint of inference in this case, that's still worthwhile. So, and the other cool part of the serverless is when you're not hogging these servers, more servers are available when you need to spike. Right? Instead of everyone, think of 1,000 companies that each hogged a server. Instead of that, when the 1,000 companies do serverless, any one of them can spike up as much as they need and spike right back down. You actually end up with almost infinite scalability. In fact, with AWS, cloud, Google, like the capacities are so high, it's almost impossible to break their scalability on serverless today, right? And as people are moving to agentic flows, one of the things they're beginning to figure out is agentic flows is multiple different models talking to each other. And if these multiple models are in different servers with the information passing through the internet, it actually becomes slower and you're wasting a lot of time and you're wasting a lot of bandwidth. When you can bring things up serverless, they tend to come up in the same area, same domain. Like Google is not giving you one computer in Boston and another computer in California. They're trying to give you stuff in the same rack if possible. So the agentic flows start becoming much more efficient. You're bringing the model to the data instead of bringing the data to the model. A lot of efficiency becomes possible when you do serverless. So do good by the planet while making yourselves a lot of money by saving on compute.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, well, let's talk about planning for this infrastructure, because I think it's not a simple or easy task. And, I've personally been there in a previous life managing infrastructure. And, it takes work. It takes skills, staffing. There's things like security, capacity management, budget challenges. And, organizations often take shortcuts to their infrastructure. And this can create downstream headaches that are tough to resolve. Are you seeing that, or how would you advise customers against taking shortcuts to infrastructure?
So the interesting problem here is I actually think they should take the right shortcuts, right? The right shortcut is knowing that you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what these models are going to look like. You don't know what your use case adoption is going to look like. All you know, it's an exponential curve. So if you have an exponential curve, any pre-planning you do is a waste of time. Because humans suck at understanding this kind of stuff, right? Like we suck at understanding the exponential. So you're always going to be falling behind. So what you need to think through is, how do I build for the highest flexibility? When you're setting up a serverless environment, what you're doing is you're saying, all of the serverless pieces are inside my cloud. I've built a big wall around it, so I don't have to worry about every serverless component security, if you will, right? They can all talk to each other. They can scale infinitely. So now I have something where my costs are tied to consumption, as opposed to I'm paying for a vector database based on how much data we plan to consume, whether or not I process it. Whereas in a serverless, what happens is you're paying for accessing that data in the vector database for the 3 seconds that you actually accessed it. Why did Hadoop fail? Hadoop failed because it demoed really well, but when people started stuffing a bunch of data into it, the cost got too high. Right? And the CIOs were getting shouted at, like, how much money did you waste? Well, that's what's going to happen with vector databases if you're not using serverless, because people are going to stuff a bunch of data in, which they'll never access, but you're paying for it. So shift from this top-down capacity planning mindset to a kind of bottoms-up flexible approach. That's the only way to succeed when the circumstances are so unknown.
Yeah, that's a great point. And in fact, that brings me to this topic of a decision framework. And, you made an excellent point about taking a more bottom-up approach. I think the key here is a structured, methodological, business-driven, business outcome-driven approach that creates an infrastructure stack for your AI initiatives. And accelerating AI adoption requires significant pivots in strategy and governance and people and technology. We've talked about that. You mentioned a lot of the examples and how people go about doing it. As we look at this journey, we are seeing leading organizations arriving at this AI fueled state by 2027. So we are 3 to 4 years away. But you need to move quickly beyond this experimentation phase and to start designing the right types of systems, implementing the right type of processes required for this future state. And given the amount of effort required, you might be asking, what is the payback? It's a logical question, right? So we believe all of you organizations, all of you will be on this journey eventually. And this is akin to the digital transformation journey that sort of took everybody, the last 10, 15 years. But the difference here is how quickly you get there and how quickly you begin recognizing the business benefits. You don't have 10 years to go about doing it. The time frame is a lot more compressed. And we drew a picture to illustrate that point. So on this slide, you will see that the blue line represents the ones that make out of this, they sort of leave the experimentation phase and make this AI pivot in 2025. And by 2027, they begin to recognize the exponential benefits of their collective AI use cases. And the purple line represents those organizations who extend the experimentation phase into 2026. Their time to recognize the business benefits are going to be extended and may not likely come together completely as their competitors. So they actually risk taking on a big business risk by extending that experimentation phase. So Arjit, to you, the question is, what advice would you offer to our listeners, to our audience on this journey, on this acceleration phase?
Actually, I love this chart because it actually is making the point I was saying earlier about exponential growth and how people suck at understanding exponential growth. Like if you're sitting there thinking, well, I'm going to wait for 3 more months for the language models to stabilize before I do something. Firstly, it's not going to stabilize in 3 months. It's going to keep changing. And secondly, if you've waited 3 months, you have given your competitors 3 months of collecting feedback data. The thing that really differentiates you from your competitors will be your ability to fine tune, your ability to make that AI yours. And the faster you get it in the hands of the largest number of users possible, the faster you start collecting that feedback data. That is your competitive differentiation. Because the language model already is getting trained on massive volumes of data on the internet. That's not going to be different between you and your competitor. The one thing you have different is that end user feedback. And every day matters there because you can never go back and tell end users, hey, sit down and you will do nothing but give feedback for the next 3 months to catch up to the fact that my competitors are ahead. Get it in their hands today. The AI doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be good enough that it can be part of the process. Secondly, look forward. Like the funniest thing was last year, we were talking to everyone about reducing operating costs. And I had people literally telling me, hey, don't worry about it. We have this big commitment to Google, or we have this big spend commitment to AWS. It's perfectly fine. We don't have to worry about it. Now they're coming to me and saying, oh my God, we have blown past our budgets because we didn't track what was happening and we didn't realize what was going on. Well, you could have guessed that this was going to happen. Because if you look at the adoption curve of GenAI compared to the adoption curve of mobile or of the internet, you should immediately be able to figure out that there is going to be a cost concern. If you haven't planned it out early, you have a problem. Go back to that slide I was showing with the benchmark we did with Intel, where at different volumes of work, you're getting different levels of cost savings. But it's in the order of It's a different order of magnitude. You gotta be planning for that right now. The next part of this is, if it's going to be that exponential adoption, can you imagine a world of the internet where somebody else was going to configure the browser for us? Why are you thinking about a world where experts create the environment for the business stakeholders? That's not going to scale. The internet took off when anybody could create their own content. Until that moment, the internet didn't actually take off that much, right? In generative AI, anybody has to be able to create their own generative AI. That's when you're going to get the exponential growth. These things are not that hard to imagine. It is hard for humans to conceive of exponential growth, but if you just try and say, look, we have seen exponential growths in the past. There are some fundamental truths. It's never going to be centralized. It's always going to be distributed. In IT, the reason we have TCP/IP instead of dedicated fiber channels, which is where the internet started from, is distributed versus centralized. Why do we have content delivery networks? Why does Akamai exist? Distributed versus centralized. You have to think about empowerment of the end user. If you're not thinking through these things, you are going to fail. I can guarantee you right now you're going to fail. But the problem is most people are still stuck on, hey, I got this pilot done by my own people in 5 months, and I want to brag about the fact my people did it, as opposed to, if I can do it in 15 minutes, what my team did in 5 months, game over. You cannot win with that manual process.
Couldn't agree more. Fascinating insights. Thank you. So we started this conversation by looking at what organizations have been doing with AI, with generative AI in the last 12 months or so. A lot of experimentation with few rewards than what we had all anticipated. There's been a lot of learning and advances on this journey. I learned a lot just talking to you, Arjit. By engaging with the right partners, I truly believe that you can accelerate your journey to being an AI fueled business. So thank you for your time today. And with that, I'd like to hand it back to Barbara.
All right. Thank you both. That was great. Great conversation. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you to my guests, Ashish from IDC and Arjit from Able. And thanks to you, our audience, for joining us. For additional information on this topic, be sure to visit the resources section on your screen. For CIO, Able, and Intel, I'm Barbara Call.